Hi, this is JC. This is chapter 11 of my book, A Detective Story. As you recall, chapter 10 ended with Ann Martin saying goodbye to her two trucking friends on the way to the seminar. Her friends were Two Shoes and Pistol Pete, and she pulled out of the truck stop, waved goodbye, and went on her way. So this will begin right after that. The rest of the trip was uneventful. The traffic was light and fast, so nothing slowed Ann down, and she kept the cruise control at 70 miles an hour. She stopped only once at a rest stop to answer the call of nature and stretch her legs. Ann got to Philadelphia that evening at 5:15 and drove directly to the Fremont Hotel. It was a large building set apart from any other buildings around it. There were parking areas at the front and on both sides. Ann parked in the front and walked through the door into an expansive lobby. She brought her overnight case with her. She approached the desk where a young, attractive woman was standing. The girl said with a smile, "I'm Anita. You must be Miss Barton." Ann was surprised. "Yes, I am," she answered. "We've been expecting you. Welcome to the Fremont Hotel. Your room is ready, and if you'll just register right here, I'll have a bellboy help you with your case." And she pushed a large, open registration book toward Ann and handed her a pen. Ann took the pen and signed the register. Then she asked, "How did you know who I was?" "I had a very good description of you from your friend, Mr. Prosser," she said with a grin, "especially your green eyes." Ann didn't return the smile. "I see," she said. She nodded and picked up her case and asked where her room was, and Anita told her how to get there. A bellboy appeared and reached for her case, but Ann said she could handle it, and she walked toward the elevator. The bellboy shrugged and didn't follow her. Ann's room was a large suite with a dining area, a kitchen area that included a refrigerator and microwave oven and a coffee pot and several packets of coffee, sweetener, and creamer, and a living area that included a sofa, an easy chair, and a large screen TV, and a desk that had writing paper, envelopes, and a pen. There was also a large notepad. In the rear was the queen-size bed and a dressing room with a toilet and shower. Alongside the bed was a lampstand with a lamp and a Gideon Bible. There was also a TV in the bedroom wall and a remote. "Not bad," said Ann aloud. She put her case and clothing on the bed and pulled open a drawer of the dresser. It looked clean, so she unloaded her things from the case, put them into the drawer. Then she opened a closet door and hung her change of clothing in the closet. All of a sudden, Ann realized she was hungry. She walked to the desk and opened a menu that was there. The menu was in 3 sections, one for each of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She checked the dinner menu. It was extensive with many different selections. She saw a 6-ounce steak dinner with a baked potato, among other things. The price was $14, and that included a beverage, soup, and salad. She considered showering, but decided to eat first, then shower. She compromised by washing under her arms and applying a deodorant and powder. Ann carefully adjusted her weapon under her arm and stepped out into the hall. She checked the door to be sure it was locked and walked toward the elevator. She found it open and went inside and pressed the number 1 button. The doors silently slid shut and the elevator began a smooth descent. At the first floor, the doors opened and Ann stepped into the lobby. She remembered the restaurant sign pointing to her left, and she walked that way. Just ahead on the left was a set of double doors with a sign that read "Conference Room." Ann stopped and looked at the doors. Each door had a bar across it that pushed. Open a door that had a bar across it that, when pushed, opened a door separately from the other. She looked at her watch. The cafe stayed open until 9 o'clock. There was plenty of time to eat, and her curiosity won over her appetite, and she pushed the bar on the right, and the door swung open. Ann stepped inside and looked around at a very large room, empty except for rows of chairs. The chairs were the kind that looked like they were fastened to the floor, but they were not. They had to be brought in and placed in rows, but they were very comfortable chairs with arms on each side of them. Ann could imagine what a job it must be to place this many chairs in such straight rows. She heard a faint murmur at the other end where the stage was. Someone was coming through the door at the rear of the stage. There were 2 men coming out of the back room. They walked onto the stage and stopped in the center and began talking. One of the men looked vaguely familiar to Anne, and she looked more closely at him. Then a light began to come on in her brain, and she realized it was Gerald Prosser, the reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. For a second, she considered turning and leaving, but before she could act on it, he saw her and called out to her. "Detective Barton," he said, "how nice to see you." Anne didn't answer immediately. She stood still and waited to see what he would say next. She felt oddly rankled that he was here and had recognized her immediately. He turned to the man with him and said, "Gary, this is Detective Ann Barton from Tulsa City, Ohio Police Department." Anne began walking slowly toward the stage where the men were. As she approached the stage, the other man walked to the edge of the stage and with a smile said, "How do you do, Detective Barton? I'm Gary Sherman, the sound man for this seminar." Anne said, "How do you do, Mr. Sherman?" Gary Sherman was an average-looking man, not someone who would stand out in a crowd. He was about 5 feet and 9 inches tall and just a little on the chubby side. He had a roundish face with a wide smile and close-set blue eyes that sparkled when he spoke. He looked like someone who enjoyed his work. Anne looked at the reporter. "You're here early, Mr. Prosser," she said. "The seminar's not until tomorrow." "I wanted to be sure to get a good seat," he said, "and a room." He grinned impishly and waited for a response from Anne. When she didn't respond, he said, "I'm in room 210, right down the hall from you." "Fancy that," said Anne, squinting her eyes, and she asked, "How do you know which room is mine?" "I asked the clerk," he said. "Anita is a sweet girl and crazy about reporters." "You could have asked me. Maybe I'll find out how she feels about detectives," said Anne, without a smile of her own. All of a sudden, Prosser realized he had violated Anne's privacy. A small panic roiled his stomach for a second. He knew he had to say the right thing now to restore any credibility he had had with Anne. His face went solemn. He waited a moment, then said, "I'm sorry, you're right. That was thoughtless and presumptuous of me. I'll get another room." He started to turn away, and Anne said, "No, it won't matter now. Keep the one you have." Anne turned to Gary Sherman and said, "It must be quite a chore getting the sound just right for a hall this big." The sound man's eyes lit up and he replied with a grin, "It's a bit of a job. This hall isn't as bad as some I've had, though. I've had some that were so big and hollow that you could speak through a megaphone and do about as well as with a PA system." Gary loved talking about his job, and it showed in his exuberance. "I'm trying a new setup. I've only done it once before. It's signal splitting. Would you like to hear about it?" Anne considered his question. She was a bit hungry and had been on her way to the cafe when she stopped here, but her curiosity was getting the better of it. "Yes, I would," she responded. "How does it work? I know a little about frequencies from using the police radio in my CB." "It's funny you should mention frequencies because that's what it's all about. Come up onto the stage and I'll explain what I'm doing," he said. Anne walked to the steps leading onto the stage, then turned and asked, "Mr. Prosser, are you coming?" Immediately the reporter answered, "You bet. This sounds interesting." He was glad she had acknowledged him. They walked up the steps onto the stage and stopped in the middle. Gary looked toward the back of the stage, and Anne did the same. "What do you see back there?" Gary asked. Anne looked the area over. "Nothing," she answered. Gary took a small microphone from his pocket and spoke into it. His voice boomed across the hall. "Look around the hall," he said. Anne perused the hall and said, "What am I supposed to be looking for?" "Listen," Gary said. He spoke into the microphone, and his voice once again boomed out into the hall. And he looked around the hall and said, "Where are the speakers?" Anne looked around the hall and said, "Where are the speakers?" "They're there," Gary said. "You just can't see them. They're set into the wall with hundreds of very small slit openings that cover a wide area to allow the sound through. The slits are made to blend in with the wall designs. It's very hard to spot them, even if you were to try." "Where are the amplifiers located?" Anne asked. Gary said, "They're behind the back wall. There are no plug-ins for the mics. They're all cordless. The amps are all completely electronic, no tubes or anything else that could produce noise. That's why the sound is so clear." He grinned broadly at that revelation. "It sounds like you've thought of everything," Anne said, and she made a move as if to leave. "Wait," cried Gary, "you haven't heard the best part yet. I'd like to use you and Mr. Prosser in an experiment, if you don't mind. It'll only take a few minutes. I'm game, Ann said, if Mr. Prosser is. Count me in, said Prosser. All right, continued Gary. This is what I need you to do. Both of you go to the center of the hall and take a seat and engage in a conversation. It doesn't matter what it's about, as long as you talk to each other. Use hushed tones as if there was a speaker up here giving a speech or something. And while you're talking to each other, I'll give you the Gettysburg Address over the PA. Now, both of you know how the Gettysburg Address goes. They both acknowledge that they did. Now, while you're talking, also listen to the speech. You know how hard it is sometimes to understand what someone is saying when there's more than voice going? I want you to pay attention to whether or not you can understand both voices. Do you know what I mean? They said they did and walked off the stage. They went about halfway down the aisle and walked between the seats until they were halfway to the other side where they sat down. If you're ready, begin speaking, and I'll start the speech. Ann and Prosser looked at each other for a second, and there was an awkward hesitation. Ann said, I guess we can talk about anything. Prosser agreed, and Gary, seeing them beginning to speak, began the speech. 77 years ago. I'm glad I was invited to this seminar, Prosser said. More glad since you're here. Ann's face reddened slightly, and she said, I don't think me being here makes much difference. I tried to get the old man to send Tom Shelton since he's the senior detective, but he said no, I was it. So here I am. Maybe I'll learn something. Prosser grinned slightly. Or maybe everyone else will, he said with a chuckle. What do you mean by that? Ann asked. Maybe they'll learn how you solved the Abbott case, Prosser said. You already know all there is to know about that, said Ann. I told you how I did it. I just played a hunch and tried a little unusual, tried something a little unusual, but it was mostly luck and the killer's conscience that really did it. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Gary's voice droned on as Ann and Prosser spoke. He was nearing the end of the speech. All of a sudden, Ann stopped talking and looked at Gary on the stage. You know, I heard every word he said clearly, and I can hear him now even while I'm talking, she said. Whoa, so can I, said Prosser. I think that was what he wanted us to see. Gary finished the speech and called out to them, well, what do you think? Did you understand me while you were talking? Ann and Prosser agreed they could understand him perfectly. Then they stood up and started toward the aisle. They walked back to the stage and asked Gary how he had accomplished that. Gary answered, it's what I call frequency splitting. Frequency splitting. I've been experimenting with it for a while, but I've just figured out how to do it. Frequency splitting, repeated Prosser. How does it work? I thought a frequency was unique and took up only its own space. That's the common belief, but as you've seen, it's not necessarily so, answered Gary. What do you do that's different? Asked Ann. I thought you'd never ask, said Gary with a grin. It's a secret, Gary said. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. He ended the sentence with a very serious look. Ann looked a question at him, and Gary grinned. Just kidding, he said. Just like anything else, it's easy if you know how. I just adjust my system to a certain frequency and begin exploring either side of the frequency. I'm sorry, but that doesn't make any sense to me. You speak of a frequency as if it were some kind of solid that can be stretched and twisted like a string. Gary looked at Ann quizzically. You just described what it took me years to accomplish. That's exactly how it works, and that's exactly how I do it. It would be almost impossible to explain in words alone how it's done. I'd have to actually do it as I explain in order for you to understand how it works. It's a very precise procedure. I first find a specific frequency, whichever one I need to transmit, and then I move it ever so slightly one way, then the other. The movement is so slight that if it were a solid, you'd have to have an atomic microscope to detect it. At some point, a small gap occurs between my frequency and the next. I tap into that gap, slightly touching both sides of the frequency band with my signal. All at once, Gary stiffened. He looked at Gerald Prosser as if he were just now seeing him the first time as a reporter. Mr. Prosser, I hope you'll be discreet about what you heard here. I never really meant to make this public. I certainly hope you won't consider this newsworthy enough to print it in your paper. I'd like this discovery to be mine alone, at least for a while. Prosser grinned broadly. "What's it worth to you?" he said impishly. Gary flushed a little. "How about dinner?" he asked. "Detective Barton, too?" he asked. "That is, if she'd like dinner." Gary looked at Ann. "How about it, Detective? Is that all right with you?" "I can buy my own dinner," she said. "I don't need to be bought off." She glanced at Prosser and winked. I didn't mean," Gary started to stammer. Ann laughed aloud and said, "All right, I give up. Come on, let's eat. I'm hungry." The trio headed for the restaurant with Ann in the lead. All of a sudden, she was really hungry. She found a table near the front of the restaurant and sat down. A waitress immediately appeared with a tray of water and menus. There's a special for dinner, stuffed pork chops. It's on the first page of the menu. If you like, I'll give you a moment," she said. Ann smiled her assent, and the waitress left. "I think I'll have the special," Ann said. Prosser said, "That sounds good," and Gary agreed, "Me too." They called the waitress over and gave their orders. She smiled and asked if they would like a drink while they waited. Ann asked what kind of beer was on tap, and the waitress said, "Bud Light." Of course. Ann ordered a glass, and Prosser and Gary followed suit. "They have rings through their noses," thought Ann with a smile. The meal went quietly, with no one seeming to want to say much. Ann was glad when it was over. She said good night and went to her room. All of a sudden, she was very tired. Ann awoke at the sound of her phone ringing. She had left a wake-up call for 6 a.m. She came fully awake immediately and got out of bed feeling very rested. Now she looked forward to the first day of the seminar. She freshened up and put on her makeup. Not much, just a few highlights, and went down to the restaurant for coffee. It was 6:30 and she was one of only 4 people there. She ordered coffee and a short stack of hotcakes and settled back to relax. "You're up early," a voice said. She knew without looking who it was. Gerald Prosser asked if he could join her, and she nodded yes. He sat across from her and motioned to the waitress. She came over and he ordered coffee and a maple bar. Ann hadn't spoken to him yet. She rubbed soft butter over her pancakes and poured maple syrup and boysenberry syrup over them, cut a small piece off the stack, and savored a bite. The waitress brought Prosser's order, and he did his ritual thing, dropped in 1 sugar, a small amount of cream, and stirred the coffee twice with his spoon. Ann asked, "What do you think this seminar will emphasize?" Prosser thought for a moment and said, "Probably different methods of deduction and crime solving. I attended a similar seminar a few years ago, and after a few mandatory jousts into normal operating crime-solving procedures, the spokesman singled out a certain detective and, using him as an example, explored new techniques of information gathering and deductions that were results of work that particular detective had done. The guy ate it up. His name was on the news for quite a while after that. His 15 minutes plus, that is, 15 minutes of fame, of course." "Who was he?" Ann asked. "He was a big old red-faced Irishman named Morton McPhee. He worked at the Cincinnati PD for 18 or 20 years. He retired a couple of years ago. He only had 20-some-odd years in, but I think the notoriety got to him. He told me once off the record that solving crimes had gotten much harder since the seminar." Go figure. "Oh, and by the way, he started at your police station in Tulsa City. He was there the better part of a year, then went to Cincy. How's that for a coincidence?"